Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has voiced strong disapproval after Washington announced steep new tariffs on some Canadian exports, describing the move as a troubling escalation in trade tensions between two of the world's most tightly linked economies. Welcome viewers to my channel. Please subscribe, like my video and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. The controversy erupted after US President Donald Trump unveiled a sweeping executive order raising tariffs on a range of foreign goods. Among the measures, certain Canadian products saw duties jump from 25% to 35%, a sharp increase that sent shockwaves through Canadian industries and policymakers. Trump justified the decision by accusing Ottawa of failing to do enough to stop the cross-border flow of fentanyl and other narcotics. Carney quickly responded, arguing that Canada is unfairly targeted. Our government has made historic investments in policing, border enforcement, and intelligence sharing, he said. Canada represents only a fraction of fentanyl entering the United States, and we are committed to working with our American partners to address this crisis. Tariffs of this nature risk harming the very relationship that has underpinned North American prosperity for generations. While the 35% headline tariff sounds severe, economists stress that its scope is limited by the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA. Thanks to the trade pact, which modernized NAFTA in 2020, about 90% of Canadian goods entering the U.S. remain exempt. This includes critical exports such as crude oil, natural gas, auto parts, fresh produce, and many industrial inputs that American manufacturers rely upon daily. However, Canadian industries outside USMCA's shield are bracing for impact. Dairy farmers, long accustomed to being a flashpoint in US-Canada trade spats, face potential losses. Lumber exporters, particularly in British Columbia and Quebec, fear the revival of a long-running softwood lumber dispute. Smaller industries, such as leather goods and niche manufacturing, could also feel squeezed as their products become less competitive in U.S. markets. According to the Royal Bank of Canada, the tariff may not devastate Canada's overall economy, but it carries symbolic weight. When Washington singles out Ottawa, it undermines confidence in the stability of the trade relationship, a recent RBC analysis noted. Investors and businesses may hesitate to make long-term decisions when political unpredictability overshadows economic logic. Canada is just one part of a much broader picture. Trump's executive order imposes fresh levies on dozens of countries, with new duties ranging from 10% to 50%. Few nations were spared. Even small Pacific economies like Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu, hardly major exporters to the U.S., were slapped with 15% duties. India, one of the largest emerging markets, was hit with a 25% tariff, while Taiwan faced a 20% levy. Laos found itself saddled with one of the steepest increases at 40%, second only to Syria, which was targeted with a punishing 41%. White House officials describe these measures as reciprocal tariffs, intended to pressure countries into offering the U.S. better trade terms. The administration has given governments 7 days to negotiate before the new rates take effect. Goods already in transit will be spared if they reach U.S. ports by October 5. Critics argue that the measures amount to economic shock therapy, forcing allies and adversaries alike into negotiations under threat of punitive tariffs. Proponents, however, say Trump is following through on his America First promise, reshaping global trade architecture to benefit U.S. industries and workers. Observers have been quick to notice a stark contrast in Washington's treatment of Canada and Mexico. While Ottawa faces immediate tariff hikes, Mexico was granted a 90-day reprieve from a similar increase. Senior White House officials told reporters that Mexican negotiators had shown greater, constructive engagement than their Canadian counterparts. Behind the scenes, however, the calculus may be more political than diplomatic. Trump is eager to tout a cooperative relationship with Mexico as he campaigns for re-election, emphasizing border security successes and trade stability. In contrast, tensions with Canada have been mounting, not only over trade but also over foreign policy. Earlier this week, Prime Minister Carney suggested that Canada could consider recognizing a Palestinian state if certain conditions were met. The remark drew sharp criticism from Trump, who called it a serious obstacle to securing any comprehensive trade agreement. By intertwining foreign policy positions with economic negotiations, Trump has signaled that trade is now a lever in broader geopolitical disputes. The White House has repeatedly linked the Canadian tariff increase to narcotics trafficking, with officials accusing Ottawa of failing to cooperate in addressing the fentanyl crisis. The highly addictive synthetic opioid has fueled a public health emergency in the U.S., with tens of thousands of overdose deaths each year. Carney rejected Washington's framing, stressing that Canada accounts for only about 1% of fentanyl entering the U.S. The majority originates from production in China and trafficking routes through Mexico. Nonetheless, he emphasized Canada's commitment to fighting the problem, citing new funding for thousands of police and border officers, along with joint U.S.-Canada intelligence task forces. Critics of Trump's approach argue that punishing Canadian exporters will do little to address the fentanyl epidemic. Tariffs are a blunt instrument for what is fundamentally a law enforcement and public health challenge, said one Ottawa-based policy analyst. If the U.S. wants to reduce fentanyl flows, it needs to work more closely with partners rather than alienating them. The tariffs are expected to drive up costs for both Canadian exporters and American importers. U.S. manufacturers reliant on Canadian wood, dairy inputs, or specialty materials may face higher expenses, which could trickle down to consumers in the form of higher prices. Economists have repeatedly warned that broad tariffs often backfire. By raising input costs for domestic companies, they can weaken competitiveness rather than strengthen it. Yet the Trump administration has dismissed such concerns. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt insisted that Trump is proving the so-called economic experts wrong at every turn, and argued that the measures are rebuilding the greatest economy in the history of the world. In Canada, officials are preparing to mitigate the fallout. Former Trade Minister Mary Ng, speaking to the BBC, noted that Ottawa has already begun diversifying trade since 2018, expanding ties with the European Union under CETA and deepening engagement with Asian markets through the CPTPP. We will not let Canada's economy be held hostage to one partner, she said. Taiwan's President Lai Ching-te sought to downplay the damage, describing the 20% levy on his country's exports as temporary. Lai expressed optimism that talks with Washington would yield an agreement, pointing out that the initial tariff announced in April was 32% before negotiations reduced it. India's reaction has been more cautious, with officials in New Delhi warning that the 25% tariff could harm sectors like textiles and pharmaceuticals. Laos, facing a 40% levy, has issued a statement condemning the measure as unfair and disproportionate. For many countries, the tariffs represent more than just economic pressure, they are a reminder of the unpredictability of Washington's trade policy under Trump. The coming months will test the resilience of the U.S.-Canada relationship. The two economies are among the most deeply integrated in the world, with cross-border trade exceeding $2 billion per day. Any sustained disruption could ripple through industries ranging from auto manufacturing to agriculture. Analysts warn that if the dispute deepens, Canada could retaliate with tariffs of its own, as it did during previous trade skirmishes over steel and aluminum. Ottawa may also accelerate efforts to strengthen ties with Europe and Asia, further reducing reliance on U.S. markets. For Trump, the tariffs are a political gamble. They allow him to project toughness and nationalistic resolve, but they risk alienating allies and fueling economic headwinds. For Carney, they present a challenge to his leadership, forcing him to defend Canada's economic interests while avoiding a spiral of retaliatory measures. As both leaders navigate domestic pressures and global scrutiny, the question remains whether cooler heads will prevail, or whether the latest tariffs mark the beginning of a prolonged and bitter trade rift between two nations that have long prided themselves on friendship and cooperation.